Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on episode 60 of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. Alright, so last we left off, I feel like I've been saying this a lot, but things are in a real dire state. Father was getting pretty darn ready to enact his whole master plot here, because given that Roy Mustang had sort of involuntarily committed human transmutation, that makes 5 sacrifices in total, and the eclipse is on the verge of starting, if it hasn't already. I mean, I assume things can only really pop off when the eclipse is as full as it's going to get, but, I'd imagine there's at least a little bit of a margin for error there. It's not like a blink and you'll miss it kind of thing. So it occurs to me that this is perhaps one of the first times I believe he was a sergeant here. The first time a sergeant has seen Second Lieutenant Ross still alive. Because I understand, everybody thought she was dead except for a select few, and then it sort of, filtered down the chain of command little by little. But at this point, I don't think it's common knowledge that Maria Ross was not, in fact, barbecued by Mustang. And it's kind of a pretty old plot point by now, so it's interesting that people are still sort of figuring it out. So Ed, the way he's talking, he says, we're not just going to sit around and let us be sacrificed by you. But I feel like if he went to the trouble to sort of gather everyone here, maybe their compliance is not a factor. I feel like there would be way too much riding on the chance that they're not willing to just go along to their death, And it is also rather unfortunate that now that all the sacrifices are gathered, most everybody else is sort of blockaded. May somehow made it through, and I don't quite remember how or why, but it's probably for the best, seeing as how I seem to recall the way alkehestrian alchemy worked here was that when Father turns off the power, so to speak, alkehestry can still do its thing. I have to admire her bravery here. She's willing to take on Father alone, provided everyone else can sort of keep pride at bay here. It is interesting to note that since that whole forcible human transmutation business, Pride seems to be sort of fraying at the edges. Yeah, everybody's sort of like putting two and two together here. And that whole business about it being a last resort, it seems like it took a rather hefty toll on Pride. He's certainly not as sturdy as he once was. Yeah, that Pride isn't immediately fighting back definitely bodes well. It would seem to indicate that perhaps he can't fight back, he's not capable anymore. Or that, I don't know, the general location is delicate enough that if he were to fight back, it would in some way hinder Father, which is definitely not a tenable state of affairs. So it is interesting that Mei Chang can, I guess, kind of stand up to Father, at least a little bit, but I mean, it definitely wasn't something that could be maintained for a long period of time. I mean, if he's operating at what, like 500,000 souls? Like, I'd imagine he can do a whole lot really quickly. Not much would faze him. Now, it's interesting, I think, that the Ishvalans are essentially playing a crucial role in everything that's going on here. Especially because they've been so maligned, not necessarily over the course of the plot, but in the backstory. They were definitely at the center of some real bad stuff. And that they are essentially integral to the counter-offensive. I mean, it seems to me that what they are doing right now is they're setting up that sort of counter-transmutation circle. Without them, I'd imagine things would get a lot worse in pretty short order. And lest we forget, Scar here, who's been, well, I mean, an out-and-out villain for most of the story, he's now doing something rather important in that he's sort of holding Wrath at bay. So Wrath is saying some interesting stuff here about essentially how none of his intrinsic characteristics matter. The fact that he's fighting a life or death battle is really the only thing that matters, and I guess that's true in a sense, because if you die, then truly nothing else does matter. But I don't know, I think there's a bit of emptiness there that belies the fact that he really truly isn't human. I think that's sort of like a central theme going on here. The homunculi act out of, if nothing else, self-interest, whereas the human characters act for the sake of others. And I guess the idea here is that maybe not selflessness, maybe not altruism, those might not be the appropriate terms, but I guess the merest consideration for others is in some way fundamentally human. I mean, when you get down to it, a lot of this is encapsulated in this little fight right here. Wrath fights, I guess just because it's what he's made to do. It's purely for his own sake, whereas Scar here is now essentially fighting on behalf of others. I mean, this sort of, yeah, it's interesting, because now Scar's essentially revealing something real important here. Not only can he deconstruct matter, he can reconstruct matter as well. You know, he has 2 sets of tattoos. So, this is very interesting indeed, because alchemy is to him essentially blasphemy or heresy, you know, something really double plus ungood here. But for the sake of something bigger, he's willing to sort of bend his own personal morals. I guess the idea here being, you know, he can't grouse about other people using alchemy if, 1, he doesn't exist, and 2, other people don't exist. You know, I do have to say, the form that Father has taken now is... I don't know. I really don't like it. I mean, it's unsettling, but I don't think it's as imminently villainous as the main villain should be, if that makes any sense. Like, it strikes me as more kind of vaguely silly. I don't know, just like that little sequence where he sort of, like, produced a gun out of his hand that sort of resembled him, like... I don't know, something about that just seems like a little silly and doesn't really fit in with the rest of the tone. So Pride here makes an interesting point about Ed, in that, you know, he's used to being so short and so much shorter than everyone else that he doesn't know how to effectively fight someone shorter than him. And I guess that's an interesting point here, because, you know, there could be some truth in that. I mean, I guess Edward sort of subverts this idea by saying, you know, I know exactly what sort of underhanded tactics a short person would use. I use them all, essentially. But I don't know, I thought that was like an interesting little point Pride was raising there, like, you know... I guess, you know, if your modus operandi is fighting people bigger than you, you wouldn't necessarily be prepared to fight somebody smaller. Of course, before anything can really truly get resolved, it seems like Father's doing his thing now. Presumably the eclipse is in full tilt and everything. Yeah, it's interesting how he sort of, like, talks to them. You know, I'm done indulging you guys, as if to really underline the fact that them sort of resisting was just, you know, something he was allowing them to do. So now that the eclipse is going down, all of these traitorous soldiers, you know, they understand what's going to happen, at least the ranking officers. So they know that if they're not in the center of the circle, things are going to get rather uncomfortable for them. And quite frankly, they kind of deserve it. You know, if you'd be so monstrous as to plot the mass killing of your entire country, like, you know, if it sort of like backfires on you, I really don't think anybody should feel any sympathy for you. So this is something that kind of loses me a little bit. Father basically says, like, have you guys ever considered that the planet might be a life form? And I don't know, that smacks too much of, like, I don't know, like eco-terrorist, like blind environmentalism, where it's like, we need to kill all people to save the planet. And it's like, the planet's not a living thing. Like, the planet itself is an inert ball of rock and metal and stuff. Like, nothing on the planet matters if there's no life on it. And yeah, I don't know. But what is interesting is that Greed has now decided that this is his time to shine. He's hoping, presumably, to take over everything and steal Father's plan for himself, but I mean, like, Greed is, after all, the incarnation of greed. Something like this was to be expected. Father would be downright stupid if he didn't expect a little treachery like this at the moment of triumph. So it seems like, Father pulled a little bit of a fast one on Greed, He sort of, faked where the center of the circle was just to sort of get Greed into position. Rather cunning of him, but I mean, that's kind of what he did before in Xerxes, wasn't it? It's like, oh, yeah, that wasn't the real center of the circle. The real center of the circle was right here. You're welcome, Hohenheim. Now, I do wonder personally, like, what's the margin of error on being in the center of the circle? Because, certainly it has to be some distance, if it's, like, wide enough to accommodate his hand. But at the same time, this is like a planetary scale. Like, it has to be a small area, otherwise all the sacrifices get pulled into it, too. I don't know. I feel like at this point I'm sort of nitpicking a little bit. It's just, there's like little details of all this cool stuff, and I'd just like to know a little tiny bit more. But, well. I mean, on one hand, I feel like nitpicking a little bit is kind of an important thing to do, saying like, this could be better, but at the same time, Fullmetal Alchemist, taken as a whole, is pretty darn good, I feel like there are only, like, little tiny things that could be done to improve it, if at all. So it is interesting that Father, who doesn't generally seem to display emotion, he is definitely, like, pretty giddy now. And, I mean, who could blame him if he's been planning this for who knows how long? But just the way he describes the situation, like this immense energy, like, if even he is sort of baffled by the amount of energy he's pulling in through the circle, like, that's gotta tell you something. Because, he's already done this to a country before, albeit one, I'm sure, that was orders of magnitude smaller. Now, this really is an ominous image with the glowing light and all those hands reaching out of the ground as everybody just sort of collapses and dies. I mean, what's worse, it seems like a rather painful thing to have your soul wrenched from your body. Just to really underline everything, we get to see all these characters we're familiar with who have been essentially killed in the process of this ritual. I'm almost reminded of the end of Evangelion with the third impact, where everybody just sort of decomposes into LCL fluid. You know, I guess the worst part about all of this is that nobody really knows what's going on. You know, everybody's just sort of suddenly struck by what's happening. You know, there's no real explanation, there's no real solution. The only thing anyone can really do is basically just sort of lie down and die. And that's a rather unfortunate circumstance to find yourself in. So I guess just to finally drive the point home that we're dealing with things on a scale far beyond that of humanity, Father sort of like emerges almost like Rey / Lilith in End of Evangelion. I almost hate to keep comparing it to that, but I'm noticing these similarities now. So Father cries out essentially to God, saying like, hey, you know, I got some business with you. And then the moon opens up like a door to reveal essentially the eye in the gate, the truth. So it is interesting how essentially from the very beginning we've seen God in action here in the form of the truth, you know. The truth is being kind of flippant, but he was essentially being truthful, ironically enough, about who and what he is. I mean, it's not like too much of that matters right now, considering exactly the magnitude of what Father is doing. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.